Go.
We're now going to show a number of features that are a little easier to show on the skeleton. We're going to begin by looking at the sternum. We see on the skeleton, or on the sternum, that we begin with the manubrium, which is this portion at the top of the sternum. The manubrium has the jugular notch in the middle, and the clavicular notches on either side that we can see receive the heads of the clavicle. If we go down, the large portion of the sternum is the body, or the gladiolus, and the very tip of the sternum is made up of the xiphoid process. The manubrium connects to the body, or gladiolus, by the sternal angle, and the tip, the xiphoid process, connects to the body via the xipho-sternal joint. Now, while we're looking at our intact skeleton, we can also see that we have 12 pairs of ribs coming down on the skeleton. The first 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, are considered the true or vertebrosternal ribs, because all of those ribs have their own cartilaginous connection to the sternum. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are considered to be the false or vertebrochondral ribs because their cartilage simply connects to the cartilage of the rib above them. And finally, ribs 11 and 12, which we can see back here, are the false or floating ribs. Now, if we pull an individual rib out, we can see that the back of the rib, the part that touches a vertebrae, is the head. We then have the skinny neck of the rib next to the head. There's then the tubercle of the rib, this conspicuous bump that we can see, which interacts with the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. We have the angle of the rib, this sharp bend, which turns the rib toward the front of the body. And finally, the shaft, the length of the rib. If we look inside the shaft, you can make out a little indent in here, and this is the costal groove, or the indent on the inner surface of the length of the rib. If I rotate our skeleton around, we can also now look at the vertebrae and how many of each we have. And we can see that we have 7 cervical vertebrae at the top, 12 thoracic vertebrae interacting with the ribs, 5 lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, and then our 5 sacrum and a mysterious number of coccygeal vertebrae further down. We're going to finish off the skeleton section here by going through the coxal bones. To begin, I have an isolated coxal or hip bone. The most conspicuous feature we have is this very large acetabulum, the hip socket that receives the head of the femur. If I cover the bottom half, we can see the ilium, which is the top bone of our coxal bones. We then can look at the bottom, and we notice one end is pointier and one end is more rounded. If I cover the pointy portion and I cover the upper portion, the back bottom quarter of our coxal bones is the ischium, and the front bottom corner of our coxal bones is the pubis. We're now going to look at the individual bones, beginning with the ilium, and at the top we can see the iliac crest, this ridge across the top. I can put my fingers on these 4 spots of the ilium. We have the anterior superior iliac spine, the anterior inferior iliac spine, the posterior superior iliac spine, and the posterior inferior iliac spine. 4 spines sticking off, but all named quite logically for where they're at. Lastly, if we look at the inside of the ilium, we can see this relatively roughed up portion which forms the auricular surface. This auricular surface interacts with the auricular surface of the sacrum. We're now going to move down to look at the ischium, which was our more rounded back bottom corner of the coxal bones. Within the ischium, we have the body, this large length of bone coming down from the acetabulum, and the ischial ramus, the back portion of this little bridge we see at the bottom. Along the ischium, we have the greater sciatic notch, this very large divot we can see here, the ischial spine, this small projection, the lesser sciatic notch, just below the ischial spine, and finally we have the ischial tuberosity, this large rounded portion that we can see at the back. We're now going to move forward to the pubis, the front bottom quarter of our coxal bones. The pubis also has a body that we can see right here, this large mass, and a ramus, which connects to the ramus of the ischium. Between those 2 ramuses, we get this hole, the obturator foramen, formed. Going back to the pubis, we can see the pubic crest, this sharp ridge that's running down the top of the pubis, ending at this bump, which is the pubic tubercle, a little bump we see at the bottom. And finally, we have the pubic symphysis, this connection point where the two portions of the coxal bones come together. We'll wrap up by looking at the coxal features on the skeleton itself. We can now see where our pubic symphysis would be, where the two bones come together. And the features you're responsible for on the pelvis are the false pelvis, which goes from iliac crest to iliac crest, the true pelvis, which is the distance across this oval we see, the pelvic brim, which is the circumference of the oval that we can see. This is also the pelvic inlet. And if we rotate the skeleton around, we can see an imaginary triangle formed between my two ischial tuberosities and my coccyx, and this represents the pelvic outlet. And that's this section.